James Carter boarded the flight from New York to Los Angeles with a single worn-out duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His jeans were faded, his sneakers scuffed, and his oversized hoodie had seen better days. His unshaven face and tired eyes made him look like someone struggling to make ends meet. As he walked down the aisle, searching for his seat in economy class, a flight attendant, Olivia Spencer, noticed him. She was in her mid-30s, sharp-featured, and always prided herself on maintaining order in the cabin. When she saw James placing his bag in the overhead compartment, she wrinkled her nose. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice edged with irritation. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" James looked at his ticket. "Yeah. 22A. She sighed. "All right. Just please be mindful of your surroundings. We have other passengers who paid good money for their comfort." James nodded but said nothing. He had long grown used to assumptions based on appearances. As the plane took off, Olivia continued to glance at James, her disapproval growing. At one point, she even whispered to a colleague, "I don't know how they let people like that on board. He looks homeless." A few hours into the flight, turbulence hit, and Olivia, making her rounds, accidentally spilled a cup of coffee on James's hoodie. "Oh, great," she muttered. "Well, I guess it can't get any worse." James wiped the coffee with a napkin, unfazed. "It's fine. Let me get you a..." She stopped mid-sentence when she noticed a sleek black credit card fall out of James's pocket as he shifted in his seat. It had no name, only a platinum logo that few would recognize, but Olivia did. It was a Centurion card, a privilege reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Her heart skipped a beat. Suddenly, she felt cold embarrassment creep over her. James noticed her expression and smirked slightly. "Something wrong?" She stammered. "Would you like a complimentary drink, sir?" James chuckled. "Oh? Now I'm sir." She forced a nervous laugh. I didn't realize that I wasn't what I seemed." James finished for her. "Yeah, I get that a lot." Silence hung between them for a moment before Olivia cleared her throat. "May I ask, what do you do?" James leaned back. "I own a few companies. Tech startups, mostly. Nothing too fancy." Her mind reeled. James Carter. The name suddenly clicked. He wasn't just wealthy, he was one of the richest men in the country, known for his reclusive nature and minimalist lifestyle. Olivia felt her face flush with shame. She had judged him without knowing a thing about him. "Mr. Carter, I..." "Don't worry about it," James interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "People see what they want to see." For the rest of the flight, Olivia remained quiet, reflecting on her own prejudices. She had spent years serving high-profile clients, always treating them with extra care. But today, she had been reminded of a valuable lesson: true wealth isn't always wrapped in designer suits. As the plane landed, James grabbed his bag and gave Olivia one last look. "Have a good day," he said with a knowing smile before walking away. She stood frozen, realizing she had just insulted a billionaire, one who had been kind enough not to hold it against her. Olivia watched as James disappeared into the crowd at LAX. The moment lingered in her mind longer than she expected. She had served thousands of passengers over the years, some rude, some kind, many forgettable. But James Carter, he was different. For the next few days, she couldn't shake the embarrassment of how she had treated him. The irony was painful. She had always prided herself on professionalism, yet she had let appearances cloud her judgment. But life moved on, and so did she. Until, a week later, she received an email. It came from her airline's corporate office, marked urgent. Subject: special event, invitation only. Dear Miss Spencer, due to your years of excellent service, you have been selected for a private client event hosted by one of our most esteemed partners. This is a unique opportunity to connect with high-profile guests. Dress code: formal. Details attached. The location: The Carter Grand Hotel, Beverly Hills. Her stomach dropped. Carter. Could it be? Dressed in a sleek black dress, Olivia stepped into the grand ballroom of the hotel. The chandelier above shimmered with hundreds of crystals, reflecting the golden light over the impeccably dressed guests. Waiters in tuxedos glided between tables, offering glasses of champagne. She felt out of place. This was not her world. A voice beside her made her jump. Didn't expect to see you here. She turned sharply. James stood next to her, now in a perfectly tailored black suit, his hair neatly styled, exuding quiet confidence. "Mr. Carter," she breathed. He smirked. "It's James." "No need for, sir, now." Olivia's cheeks burned. I didn't know this was your event." He took a sip of his drink. "I figured." A long pause. Then, to her surprise, he gestured toward a private table. "Care for a conversation?" She hesitated but nodded. Seated in a quiet corner of the ballroom, James leaned back in his chair, studying Olivia. "So," he started, "tell me, how often do you judge passengers like that?" She winced. "Honestly, more than I'd like to admit." James chuckled. "At least you're honest." She sighed. "I grew up poor. I had to fight for everything. And in this job, you see so many entitled people. I guess I just assumed." "You assumed wealth looks a certain way." She nodded. "Yes." James tapped his fingers on the table, then said something unexpected. "I get it. People assume things about me, too. They think money solves everything. That it makes you invincible. But when you strip it all away, people treat you differently." Olivia stuttered him. "You test people, don't you? Dressing the way you do." He smirked. "Sometimes." "Why?" "Because it tells me who's real." She swallowed hard. "And what did you think of me?" James considered her for a moment. Then, with a small smile, he said, "I think you learned something that day." She exhaled in relief. "I did." For the first time, Olivia saw James not as a billionaire, not as a passenger, but as a person. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was having a real conversation, one that mattered. As the evening went on, the tension faded. They talked about travel, about life, about the assumptions people make. And as Olivia left the event, she realized something strange. She actually wanted to see James Carter again. A few weeks had passed since the gala, but Olivia couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with James. It wasn't just his wealth or his unconventional attitude, it was the way he had looked at her, as if he saw something deeper. Then, one afternoon, while she was on a break at the airline lounge, her phone buzzed. "Unknown number, dinner tonight." Her heart skipped. There was no name, but she knew exactly who it was. "Olivia, are you testing me again?" A minute later, the reply came. "James, maybe. But I also hate eating alone." She smirked, then typed back. "Olivia, all right. But this time, I picked the place." When James arrived at the small, hole-in-the-wall Mexican restaurant Olivia had chosen, he looked completely at ease. No suit, no luxury car, just him in another worn hoodie and sneakers. "You really don't care about appearances, do you?" she asked as they sat down. James shrugged. "Not when the food's good." She laughed. "Fair enough." They ate, talked, and joked like old friends. Olivia found herself forgetting who he was, forgetting the money, the status, the assumptions. But then, halfway through dinner, something changed. A man in a suit approached their table, looking uncertain. "Excuse me. Are you James Carter?" James barely glanced up. "Just trying to eat, man." The man hesitated, then quickly backed away. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "That happen often?" "More than I'd like." James sighed. People either judge me for looking broke or treat me like royalty when they know who I am. There's no in between. She leaned forward. And what do you want? James met her eyes. I want real. Something about the way he said it made Olivia's pulse quicken. After dinner, they took a walk down a quiet street. The air was crisp, the city lights reflecting off the pavement. Can I ask you something? Olivia said. James smirked. I think we are past permission at this point. She rolled her eyes but continued. Why do you still fly economy? James laughed. You really can't let that go, can you? Humor me. He thought for a moment. Because I built everything from nothing. I never want to forget what it feels like to be there. She considered that. So what's next? Another test. James stopped walking and looked at her seriously. No tests. Just an offer. She felt her breath catch. What kind of offer? I need someone I trust. Someone who doesn't care about the money, who sees through the bullshit. He paused. Come work for me. Olivia blinked. What? Not as an assistant. Not as an employee. As a partner. She scoffed. James, I'm a flight attendant, not a business mogul. Yeah, he said with a smirk, and I'm a billionaire who eats at taco stands. Your point. She shook her head in disbelief. Why me? Because you're real, he said simply. And I don't have a lot of that in my life. Silence stretched between them. Olivia had spent years navigating a world of people who looked down on her. Now, one of the richest men in the country was offering her a chance at something bigger. She could say no. She could walk away. But for the first time in years, she didn't want to. On a cold, dreary evening, a man boarded the last train to the city. He wasn't much to look at, worn-out boots, a threadbare jacket, and unkempt hair. His name was Daniel, and he wasn't traveling by choice. His life had fallen apart in the most crushing way possible, and this train ride, like the rest of his existence, was one he couldn't afford but had no other option but to take. As the train clattered along the tracks, Daniel settled into a seat near the back. The compartment was nearly empty, save for a few commuters, their faces glued to their phones or staring blankly out of the windows. He tried not to attract attention, his gaze lowered, but he knew he couldn't hide the dirt that clung to him. His shirt was stained, and his jacket smelled faintly of old sweat and smoke. It was as if every mistake he'd ever made had marked him, and there was no escaping it. A few minutes later, the train stewardess, a young woman with tight, professional features, walked down the aisle. Her eyes swept over the passengers with practiced indifference until they landed on Daniel. The look in her eyes changed instantly, a flash of disdain crossing her face. She approached him briskly, her heels clicking sharply against the metal floor. Excuse me, she said, her voice cold and clipped. This is a premium service. We expect all passengers to maintain a certain level of cleanliness and decency. You need to leave or clean yourself up. Daniel looked up at her, his tired eyes meeting hers. His stomach twisted, but he said nothing. He knew that his appearance had once been a source of pride, but now it seemed to repel everyone he met. He had lost everything, his wealth, his home, his self-worth, and yet, the world still judged him based on his external appearance. The stewardess crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently. I'm serious. If you can't meet the standards, you need to get off. The other passengers glanced at Daniel, their faces contorted in silent judgment. He could feel their eyes on him, their whispers swirling like a cloud of shame. He stood up slowly, not because he wanted to, but because he could feel the weight of their judgment sinking into him. As he made his way toward the door, the stewardess watched him with a smug expression, confident she had put him in his place. But just as Daniel was about to step off the train, the door slid open with a sharp hiss. A man in a dark, expensive suit rushed in, his shoes gleaming like polished silver. He scanned the compartment, his gaze briefly landing on Daniel. Without a word, the man approached the stewardess. "Excuse me, but I need to speak with you," the man said, his voice firm but composed. The stewardess turned to him, frowning. "Is there a problem?" "Indeed there is," the man replied, his tone now sharp with authority. "That passenger you just humiliated. He's Daniel Ackerman. You know, the billionaire entrepreneur whose company is one of the largest tech firms in the world. And you just treated him like a beggar." The stewardess's face drained of color as the words hit her like a slap. She glanced over at Daniel, her eyes now wide with shock. She hadn't recognized him. In the moment of judgment, she had failed to see past the grime, the worn clothes, and the tired eyes. She hadn't known that the man sitting in front of her had been the one who built the empire she worked for. The one who had been at the top of the world and lost everything in a series of bad investments. Daniel stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he said nothing. He wasn't angry at the stewardess. He wasn't angry at anyone anymore. He had long since given up on trying to explain who he was. Now, he simply took what came his way. The man in the suit, seeing the stewardess's stunned silence, sighed. "You've just made a mistake that might cost you more than your job. You humiliated a man who could have helped you, or anyone in this company, in ways you can't imagine." The stewardess stammered, clearly not knowing what to say. She was mortified. Her eyes flickered nervously between Daniel and the man, unsure whether to apologize or just stand there in silence. Daniel finally spoke, his voice soft but with a quiet strength. "Don't worry about it. It's not the first time." His words, simple as they were, seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of his experiences. The man in the suit gave a curt nod, but his eyes remained fixed on the stewardess. "Next time, think before you speak. You don't know everyone's story just by looking at them." And with that, the man turned and left, leaving the stewardess standing there, speechless. She watched as Daniel returned to his seat, his back straight and his gaze unflinching. For the rest of the ride, no one dared say a word to him. They all silently acknowledged the invisible force he carried with him, the one that money and power had once bestowed upon him, but now lay dormant, waiting to be awakened again. As the train pulled into the station, the stewardess stood frozen by the door, her face pale with embarrassment. Daniel stepped off the train, his footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the night. He had no plans to ever reveal his identity again. The world had already made its judgments, and he had learned long ago that nothing could change their perception of him. But deep down, he knew that one day, when the time was right, he would rise again, not for revenge, but for himself. He would rebuild what had been lost, and he would be the one to decide how the world saw him next. A few days later, Daniel found himself back at the same station, although this time, he was not traveling alone. He had managed to keep his identity under wraps for the past few weeks, but something in him told him that it was time to move forward. The world had judged him, and that had made him bitter. Yet, there was a part of him that wanted to prove that who he had been, the successful, confident billionaire, was not gone forever. He wasn't wearing the same dirty clothes this time. His outfit was simple but well-tailored, a far cry from his previous state. But there was still something about him that didn't quite align with the polished man he once was. His eyes, though, were different. There was no longer the flicker of arrogance, only a quiet determination that seemed to draw people's attention. As he waited for his next train, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was the stewardess, still wearing her uniform, though she appeared more disheveled than before. Her face was pale, and her movements were hesitant, as though she was unsure of herself. She was scanning the crowd, her eyes flitting over the passengers, but it was clear she was searching for something, or someone. Their eyes met for a moment, and she froze. Recognition spread across her face, and she took a tentative step toward him. "Mr. Ackerman," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to apologize for what happened." Daniel stuttered her, his expression unreadable. He had not expected this. His first instinct was to brush her off, to let her know that it didn't matter. But for some reason, he hesitated. Maybe it was because he, too, had learned something about the nature of people, about the fragility of success and the weight of perception. "It's okay," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. You made a mistake, and so did I. But it's behind us now. The stewardess nodded, clearly relieved but still unsure of how to continue. I've been trying to get my life back together. I've made a lot of mistakes too, and after what happened on that train, You don't need to explain yourself, Daniel interrupted, raising his hand. I know what it feels like to lose everything. To feel as if you've become invisible to the world. The stewardess blinked, taking a step closer. You lost everything, she asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. But you're Daniel Ackerman. You are one of the richest men in the world. Daniel gave a small, bitter smile. Life has a way of humbling you. You think you have control over everything, but then, one day, it all slips through your fingers. She didn't know what to say to that. The words hung between them, uncomfortable but truthful. I'm trying to rebuild, Daniel continued, his gaze turning toward the train tracks. But it's different now. I've learned that money doesn't mean much if you've lost your dignity along the way. The stewardess stood silently, absorbing his words. Her eyes softened as she looked at him, a new understanding forming between them. She, too, had been a person of pride and status. Yet now, seeing Daniel standing before her, she realized how fragile that illusion of control really was. I'm sorry for how I treated you, she said again. I shouldn't have judged you. I had no right. Daniel looked at her, his eyes searching hers. We all make mistakes. Some of us are lucky enough to learn from them. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the noise of the station swirling around them. Daniel realized that, in some strange way, this encounter had been just as much for him as it had been for her. He didn't need an apology, what he needed was to understand that life was full of second chances. The world was full of people who would try to define him by his lowest moments, but he was not bound by their perception. He was the one who decided who he would become. As the train arrived, he turned to her, offering a small nod. Good luck, he said quietly. She gave him a hesitant smile before stepping back, allowing him to board. But just as the doors were about to close, Daniel heard a voice behind him. Mr. Ackerman. He turned to find the stewardess running toward him, her face flushed with determination. I don't know what you're planning, but if you ever need help with anything, rebuilding, connections, I'd be honored to assist you. Daniel's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in quiet consideration. There was something in her offer, something genuine. Maybe she had learned from her mistake. Maybe, in her own way, she was offering him a lifeline. I'll think about it, he said, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely alone. The train doors closed, and as it pulled away from the station, Daniel stared out the window, his thoughts drifting. The past could never be undone, but it didn't have to define him. He still had time to rebuild, time to reconnect, and maybe, just maybe, time to find a new purpose. And if he could do that, then perhaps the world would finally see him as he truly was, not as a man who had fallen but as one who had risen again. The journey, he realized, was far from over. Weeks passed and the memory of the encounter at the station began to fade into the background of Daniel's life. But something had shifted in him. It wasn't just the reminder that people could change, but also the realization that he still had the power to shape his future. He couldn't let his past mistakes define him forever. One evening, as he sat in a modest cafe, far from the extravagant places he used to frequent, he noticed something strange. The stewardess, the same one he had encountered on the train, was standing at the counter, talking to the barista. He wasn't sure if she had seen him yet, but she looked different. Gone was the polished uniform, replaced by a simple dress and a tired yet determined expression. She was no longer the woman in charge of enforcing the rules but someone trying to find her way, just like him. He wasn't sure why, but he decided to approach her. Hey, Daniel said, trying to keep his voice casual, though it wasn't easy. It had been a long time since he had initiated a conversation with anyone he wasn't trying to impress. I didn't expect to see you here. The stewardess turned around, her eyes widening with recognition. She seemed to hesitate, then smiled faintly. Mr. Ackerman, I didn't think I'd run into you here either. You're far from the boardrooms. Daniel chuckled, feeling strangely at ease. I guess I've been avoiding those. You're not in your usual uniform. Looks like you're taking a break from the corporate world too. She nodded, her smile faltering. I've been making some changes. My old job didn't offer me much more than a paycheck, and I realized it wasn't fulfilling anymore. So I started something new. A little cafe, you know. It's not much, but it's mine. Daniel studied her for a moment. She looked tired, but there was a glimmer in her eyes that hadn't been there on the train. She was figuring things out, just like he was. That's brave, he said. Most people would have stuck with what was safe. She shrugged. I've learned that safe doesn't always mean happy. She paused, then added, I wanted to say something before, after what happened on the train, but I didn't know if I should. Now, I just want to tell you. I'm really sorry for how I treated you. Daniel's heart gave a small tug at her sincerity. It had been so long since someone had apologized for their actions, but something about her humility made him feel that it wasn't just about the past. It was about who she had become in the process of change. You don't need to apologize, he replied. I think we both learned something that day. I did, at least. It's not about what you've lost, it's about how you rebuild. And sometimes it takes a little humility to realize that you're not invincible. The stewardess nodded, clearly moved by his words. I've spent so many years thinking I had everything under control. But life has a funny way of making you realize that it's not about control. It's about resilience. And understanding that sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that teach you the most. They both stood in a comfortable silence, the noise of the cafe buzzing around them. Daniel wasn't sure why he had come here today, or why he had felt compelled to speak to her. But somehow, in the middle of this small cafe, he felt something shifting again, another piece of his life falling into place. I'm trying to figure out what's next, Daniel admitted, his voice quieter now. I'm not the man I was before. And I don't know if I'll ever get back to who I was. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe I need to find a new path, one that isn't defined by old mistakes. The stewardess smiled gently. You will. We all do. And sometimes the best way to rebuild is to start with something small and real. I know this cafe doesn't look like much, but it's the most honest thing I've done in years. I feel proud of it. And maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about the empire you build, but about building something that matters. Daniel nodded, a feeling of warmth settling in his chest. Maybe you're right. He hesitated before speaking again, feeling an odd sense of camaraderie forming between them. Would you ever want to work together? I'm not sure where I'm going with this idea yet, but I've been thinking a lot about starting something new. Maybe not a business, but a way to help others rebuild, like we did. The stewardess raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Help others rebuild. I'm listening. Daniel chuckled, running a hand through his hair. I've been through a lot. But I've learned a few things about what really matters. And I think there are a lot of people who feel like they are lost or stuck. I want to create something that helps people find their way again, help them understand that just because they've fallen doesn't mean they can't rise again. There's power in starting over. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt like the weight of the world had shifted. That sounds like something worth doing, she said slowly. Maybe we can help each other with that. You've got the experience, I've got the heart. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was standing on the edge of something bigger than just rebuilding his own life. He wasn't sure how it would look yet or what shape it would take. But one thing was clear, he wasn't alone in this journey. And together, they might just find a way to help others rebuild, too. The next chapter was yet to be written, but Daniel was ready to start. And for once, he didn't feel the need to rush ahead. The road ahead would unfold, and whatever came next, he would face it with the same resilience that had carried him through his darkest days. As weeks turned into months, Daniel and the stewardess, whose name he had learned was Sarah, began to work together on their shared vision. They called it Rising Together, an initiative to help people who had experienced their own personal falls, whether through financial struggles, emotional hardship, or a loss of direction. The goal was simple: to give them the tools and the support to rebuild their lives, just as they had. They started small, organizing community meetings and workshops, offering guidance, encouragement, and, most importantly, understanding. Daniel shared his experiences, the highs and lows of his previous life, and how he had learned that true success wasn't about wealth or power, it was about resilience, integrity, and finding purpose in the most unexpected places. Sarah, with her own story of falling from grace and starting anew, became a beacon of hope for others. They found their work deeply fulfilling. Every person they helped, every story they heard, reminded them of how far they had come and how much further they could go together. One day, as Daniel sat in their modest office, looking out at the city skyline, he received a call. It was an old contact from his past life, someone who had worked with him when he was a billionaire. The voice on the other end was familiar, but there was a tension in the air. "Daniel, we've been watching what you're doing. Rising Together, it's making waves. You've built something good here. We think it's time to take it to the next level. We want to help fund it, give you the resources to expand." Daniel listened, but as the offer unfolded, he felt an unfamiliar unease. The old temptations, the allure of wealth and influence, tugged at him, but he paused. He thought of Sarah, of the work they had done, of the people they had helped. "No," he said firmly, surprising even himself. "I appreciate the offer, but this is not about money. This is about something real, something we've built from the ground up. I'm not interested in scaling it for profit. I want it to stay true to its purpose." There was a long silence on the other end before the voice spoke again, slower this time. "I understand. But just know, opportunities like this don't come often. You could build something even bigger than you ever imagined." "I don't need bigger," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I just need real. And that's what we are doing here." The call ended, and Daniel sat back in his chair, feeling a strange calm wash over him. He had come full circle. The man who had once craved power, status, and control now found his fulfillment in something that wasn't about accumulation, but about giving. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. Instead, he was building something that would outlast him. Later that afternoon, Sarah joined him in the office. She had a cup of coffee in hand, and her face lit up when she saw him. "Everything okay?" she asked, sitting down beside him. Daniel looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Everything's perfect." Together, they had created something meaningful. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. They may have started from nothing, but they were now part of something much bigger than themselves, a movement of people who were learning to rise, to rebuild, and to live with purpose. And as they continued on this path, they both knew that no matter what came next, they were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. And in that, they had found their true success.